So I appreciate, this is a real opportunity personally for me and professionally. I've actually had the opportunity of working in Missouri for a few years, but in particular in the last year or two. Just by way of background, I had the real fortunate opportunity of being very involved at a very deep level in workforce development early in my career. In the 1990s, I'm from Maine originally, actually, so go Red Sox. Big Red Sox and Patriots fan, before it was popular to like the Red Sox and Patriots. We moved to Arizona in 1980 when I was 12 years old, Lake Havasu, Arizona. Does anybody know what Lake Havasu is famous for? London Bridge. The London Bridge got moved to Lake Havasu. It's a Trivial Pursuit question, so if you ever get that. And then went to college in Utah and had the opportunity of starting my career in Utah. Well, flash forward to about 1996, 1997. I was working at the Office of Family Support, which is the welfare reform agency in Utah. It was in the Utah Department of Human Services. And Utah was a very innovative state when it came to welfare reform. They got their first set of waivers in 1991, pre-TANF, and pre-Personal Responsibility Act of 1996, and I was involved in some of that early work. Well, Governor Mike Leavitt, who I had worked on his 1992 campaign when he first ran for governor, decided he wanted to do workforce reform. And it was done in a couple of stages. In 1996, they ran a bill which became sort of a planning bill. It created committees that said, we're going to create this new Utah Department of Workforce Services. I was at the Office of Family Support, and unlike in a lot of places where people get nervous about those kind of processes, there was a group of us that said we should be engaged in this conversation. So in 1997, during the Utah legislative session in January, I actually worked as the point person working with legislative staff to implement two major pieces of legislation in Utah. One was the creation of the Utah Department of Workforce Services, where we merged 4 state agencies into one. Job Service, the Office of Family Support, which was the welfare agency. We merged the job training programs, and what am I forgetting? Job Service, welfare, job training, and then there was a smaller Office of Child Care and some other smaller agencies. But what we did there is in Utah, there are no WIOA, now what's WIOA, local boards. The state runs the one-stops throughout the state of Utah. In state legislation, we created local operating boards like what you have here, but we're not beholden to the federal government in that. So it's called the single state area. And again, I worked on the legislation and became the public affairs director. So I had about 4 months before July 1st of '97 to go from yellow page ads to TV commercials to help the public with what was happening, with where to go for services. It was a very big endeavor. One of the early opportunities I had was we did a lot of was called one-stop redesign. We had to make a lot of decisions. Are we going to have upfront teams? How do we integrate these programs together? Who's actually, is it teams? Is it a person? What happens when a customer walks through the door? How are we going to do business engagement? All of those kinds of things early in my career I was very involved with. Had the opportunity to go back to Washington, D.C. To work for the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, and then had the opportunity to, in August of '01, be Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Employment and Training Administration in the Department of Labor. The Employment and Training Administration is an $11 billion agency. It's up to about 12 or 13 now, but at the time it was $11 billion. And it's the agency that funds the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act dollars, adult dislocated worker youth. It funds unemployment insurance, administrative dollars. DWD gets Wagner-Pfizer dollars, if that program rings a bell. I know there's an alphabet soup of these different programs. And so I was the number 2 at that agency. I was a political appointee of the George Bush administration, and I was there from 2001 to 2007. Had the opportunity to go back out to Utah and was Vice President of Institutional Advancement at Salt Lake Community College, which is one of the 5 largest community colleges in the country. I was Vice President of Institutional Advancement, so I oversaw fundraising, marketing, business engagement practices, instituted a lot of reforms there for the college, worked with the legislature, did all of that work. The foundation was under me, grant writing, so I kind of had, I always called it the entrepreneurial part of the college. That's what we did. Went back to Washington, D.C. I live in Northern Virginia, and had a year or two of transition. Worked for the University of Phoenix, did some business development work for them for a year in 2011. Started my own business in June of 2010, my LLC, Work-Ed Consulting, and then in summer of 2012 decided to go full-time. My engagement in Missouri goes back to 2011 in my consulting practice. I don't know, Peter, you may know this, Mo Health Wins. Does that ring a bell? It was the grant that the state won, a Department of Labor grant back in 2011. I wrote that grant. I worked with all the colleges. I was the one that sort of came in and said, colleges, you all need to work together as one consortium, not sit on other people's grants, but have a systems approach to grant writing, getting money, workforce development. And that really launched then rounds of these grants that came. There were 4 rounds of what were called TACT grants, TAACCCT, that came to states and to community colleges in particular for job training and for capacity building at the college level. There was Mo Health Wins, there was Mo Manufacturing Wins, and then there was Mo STEM Wins. And then more recently, I wrote the grant and been engaged with State Technical College for their what's now Justice Involved Individual project called Mo Start, if any of you have heard that. Alex is very involved, and that's when I first met Alex, actually, was when we were working on the grant writing for that. And Alex, I think you had just gotten your current position at that time, and so I was working with Nancy Wiley at the college with Alex, and so since that time have been engaged with Alex, Nancy, and others, have met with Director Precythe as a result of that grant project, and working on justice involved individuals getting back into the workforce here in Missouri, and I think there's some really exciting things happening. In my Work-Ed Consulting business, I've been engaged in roughly 19 to 20 states in a whole host of activities. I've done third-party evaluation, I've done grant development. I hate calling it grant writing. It's really project development, to be honest. I mean, TR knows. I mean, it's a lot of times I always say colleges don't know what they don't know. I've done a lot of it for community colleges, and so been involved a lot in that. I've done technical assistance, actually done some project management on behalf of, in particular, community colleges and others, and so it's really exciting. This opportunity here is particularly exciting for me because I really think that this is on the front end of some reforms and changes that are happening locally through workforce development systems. As some of you, especially from the private sector, have figured out, it's kind of a confusing situation, right? And it's one of the big problems we have. The federal government funds an array of job training programs through multiple federal agencies that come down to multiple state agencies that end up in multiple places in states. And the whole goal of the one-stop system is to try to, at the local level, figure out ways to manage and bring those funding streams together on behalf of workers and employers in a region and in a local community. And it's a difficult job. And it's not made any easier by the federal government, frankly. One of the things I did when I was at the Department of Labor is we were trying to efforts around reforming and streamlining. I mean, you just look in this room right now, you've got vocational rehabilitation, which is funded out of the U.S. Department of Education. You've got adult education literacy funded out of the U.S. Department of Education. That funding stream goes to a separate agency. That funding stream goes to a separate agency. The Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act from my old agency, Department of Labor, comes to the Division of Workforce Development and down through to the local areas. You've got the TANF program that comes through the Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, that ends up at a different state agency. And I've worked in other states, and this is what I did in Utah, where in Utah what we did is we took the TANF. Voc Rehab's now part of the department. It wasn't when I was there, but about 2 years ago, they moved Voc Rehab from Department of Ed to Department of Workforce Services. Adult Ed and Literacy, I think, is still out of the Department of Education in Utah, but we took all these programs, basically said one state agency is going to manage them, not 3 or 4 or 5. In my state now of Virginia, I've been doing some work at the state level for them. They have Wagner Pizer Employment Services and UI goes to the Virginia Employment Commission. They have the WIOA money goes to the Virginia Community College system at the state level. Voc Rehab goes to the Division of Adult Rehabilitation Services. TANF goes to the Department of Social Services. I mean, you have multiple state agencies from multiple federal agencies trying to manage this money. It comes down locally. Frankly, in Virginia, TANF Workforce Services is being provided by a whole separate staff from the local workforce staff, from the VR staff, and it's just a hodgepodge. I always say this, that if you look at the laws that we're talking about, most of them were created during the New Deal in the 1930s. Unemployment insurance is an example of that. That's a New Deal law that has remained relatively unchanged all these years. And most of the other programs were created in the 1960s. Voc Rehab was 1920, I think, wasn't it? I mean, if you operated a private business the way we operate federal programs, you'd have been out of business a long time ago, because these programs have legacies that go back a long time, and it's very hard to change. You've seen the environment in Washington, D.C. That environment has been like that in terms of these issues for a long, long time. Anytime somebody wants to try to reform something, you get different groups coming out of the woodwork saying, don't touch us, don't do that. It's just the way it is. So what it means at the end of the day is groups like this in this room, it's up to you. The rubber meets the road here. And my job, hopefully, is to help you with ideas, innovation, third-party review, another set of eyes, develop the data and materials and look at it in a different way that help you make decisions and help you be strategic in the work you're doing as a board. So I hope that helps as a background. For this particular job, I also have worked with an individual. She's in Northern Virginia as well. Her name's Kavita Mittapalli. I do not have employees, so one of the things I do is I do all my work through partnerships with other small businesses, typically, where I 1099 in that regard, but they're part of a team. And Kavita Mittapalli is somebody who I also put in the bid into Kevin and Alex. She's a PhD researcher, and she's going to help with some performance and data analysis. So I've got that capability as part of this project as well, so we can help with some of that. So let's talk about this project in particular. I wanted to talk about what is this one-stop operator thing anyway, and why does it even exist, and why did Alex have to look at, and the board have to look at hiring one, and what were the decisions, that sort of thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's the new vision for what am I supposed to do anyway, and then talk about some of the deliverables, and then I also have some other information as well. I've talked a little bit about this, but I just want to talk about the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. Again, as board members, this is the Adult Dislocated Worker and Youth Money. Does that all ring a bell? Everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? And I'm not saying this is bad, I just know a lot of this can be very confusing. I don't know how long some of you have been board members. So this goes back to the 1970s. And in mid to late 1970s, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, or CETA, was created. Now, ironically, when I was a young boy in Maine, my dad was a local CETA director, believe it or not. So, some things just come back around. And CETA was created in the late 70s primarily as monies that, this is what started the federal to local money relationship. If you look at most of the programs, most of the dollars go to the state, and the state makes decisions about how to administer those programs. TANF's a perfect example, Voc Rehab are perfect examples. States get those money, and then through state legislation, governors, they decide either state employees manage those programs, or in some cases, TANF in particular, some states flow those dollars down locally for administration. But the CETA program created the state to local relationship to cities and counties for primarily things like summer job programs, sort of paid work opportunities. There were issues with that program. In 1982, President Reagan was in office, wanted to zero out, my understanding is wanted to, if you look at the history of it, wanted to zero out and get rid of CETA, but it got reformed to the Job Training Partnership Act. Some of you have probably heard of that. The Job Training Partnership Act existed until 1998. And some of the challenges with the Job Training Partnership Act were it had a lot of sort of mismanagement, fraud, in some cases fraud and other problems. And the main criticism of JTPA was that you had fly-by-night training providers who weren't connected at all to jobs, and were just, people were lining their pockets doing training for people for which they're then left with no work. So the Workforce Investment Act was passed in 1998, and that's really the law that sort of turned it to more of an employment-focused program. And in some cases, if you were around during the 1999, 2000, 2001 timeframe, which is when I was first involved, there were a lot of debates because TANF had passed and was implemented, and that was very much a work requirements, get somebody into a job, get them job experience program. And there was a lot of debate when WIA was started around, is this a work first program as well? The Workforce Investment Act took it, JTPA was primarily a job training program. The Workforce Investment Act created 3 levels of services: core, intensive, and training. And when we did some data analysis at the federal level when I was at the Department of Labor, very few people actually were using WA dollars to get training. So that kind of became a criticism, frankly, some of it from people like myself who were at the federal level, that there was too much of the WIA dollars going to, frankly, keep the doors open of one-stops versus actually giving people resources to be able to go and get skills upgrades and training. And it's kind of a criticism that's continued to this day, although in some cases it has gotten better. States like Florida and others have actually passed state legislation mandating a certain amount of dollars have to be used for training services. So that's something that's happened there. And then about 3 years ago, the Workforce Investment Act was finally upgraded, so to speak, to the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. Now, I was involved very heavily in WI reauthorization because the law was supposed to be reauthorized in 2003, but just like everything else in DC, it takes you 10 to 12 years to actually change something. And so ironically, there are things in the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act that passed in 2015 that I actually personally was involved in negotiating and sort of coming up with in the law way back when I was there in 2004, 5, and 6, and 7. So I know the law fairly well, actually. So that is the sort of evolution of the law. Now, boards, workforce investment boards were created in WIA. Before they were called private industry councils, or PICs, under JTPA. And again, there was some criticism of that as well, which is why things like one-stop operators exist. Because PICs were sometimes, again, my first involvement in the 90s, I was hearing these things, that it was the people, it was like retirees of businesses were sitting on PICs. It wasn't actual business people engaged currently in the community. I mean, there were a lot of criticisms about who's sitting on PICs, what are they actually doing, what's their role. So the idea in WIA was to really upgrade the idea of boards and have them be business-led advisory boards. And that has continued on under WIOA, WIOA as workforce development boards. So the idea is that you are literally the oversight for your region, for workforce activities in your region, frankly, regardless of whether it's dollars that are flowing down directly to the board through WIOA, or whether it's TANF dollars, adult ed dollars, voc rehab dollars. It's your responsibility as a board, in theory, to oversee all of that. So why one-stop operator? Well, in the federal regulations for the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, the federal regulations that just went into effect about a year and a half ago, the idea, there's one job for someone like me that you've just hired, technically speaking, which is coordinates the service delivery of required one-stop partners and service providers. So what does that mean, coordinates the service delivery? Well, it's pretty open-ended, right? It gives you a lot of flexibility to define what that means. It does not mean, when you hear one-stop operator, I think people's first inkling is that it's somebody who makes sure that when the pipe bursts, that the building's taken care of, and that's not the idea of that position. The state owns some of the buildings. You have one-stops, probably the local entity, governmental entities own some of them. They may be privately owned and leased. There's somebody else whose responsibility is to make sure when the pipe bursts or the bathrooms don't flush, that those get taken care of. The idea of a one-stop operator is that it's meant to be that the board stay at that advisory and strategic level, and that you're procuring or you're hiring other people to help manage the services and service delivery. So you have people that are one-stop operators or organizations. You also can procure for services, for career services, for training services. In some cases, I know some of the reforms that you're doing now around service delivery are because of some issues with contracting, that you're bringing some of that in-house, and that's fine too. The law allows that with approvals by the state and others, if that makes the most financial sense. But the one-stop operator is supposed to coordinate the service delivery. It also says in the regulations, local boards may establish additional roles, coordinating service providers across the whole system, providing services within the center. Now, we're not going to do that. I won't be providing services within the center, or coordinating service in a multi-center area, which includes affiliated sites. So what has Central Workforce Development Board decided to do with that? So we've really, and in the proposal that I provided, that I was writing on the back of, which is really our map for the work we're doing, and we were at lunch yesterday talking about this. We really had 2 or 3 major activities that are going to occur that I'm going to help with. One is financial asset mapping, looking at how is money being spent now, which programs are involved in the service delivery, at what amounts. So taking that and baselining, where are you at today? And then part of what I'll do is gather information, probably do some interviews, may even need to call some of you over the phone and chat with you for a few minutes and talk about, sort of what's the program contribution, what's happening, and then do analysis of that, and then develop an asset map report that takes a look at not only where are you at, but where could you be? Are there cost efficiencies? Are there recommendations? Frankly, I will look at the facilities you're currently in, make recommendations. For instance, let me give you an example. I'm just using this as a hypothetical. I have no idea. But let's say Voc Rehab is operating out of a building in one of the towns here in the service area, and there's a small one-stop site, or Alex has staff in a building right next door where the lease is running out. Well, it may make more sense as a recommendation, the asset map, say, hey, it makes more sense to talk to Voc Rehab about could staff move into their building, and then the Voc Rehab is operating an affiliate site at that point. One of the things I've seen across the country often is people think of the one-stop centers as being, I'm going to use the word in quotes, owned by the board running it. And I've argued time and time and time again, no, you need to take a broader view of it. If Voc Rehab has locations, if TANF has locations, if other partner programs have locations, we should be mapping all of that infrastructure, looking at are they owned by state or local governments? Are they leased by state or local governments? What is sort of the current arrangements? And make strategic decisions. There's huge efficiencies you can make sometimes by doing that kind of asset mapping. So that's one of the things I'll be doing for you, is looking at your current infrastructure, looking at how money's spent, looking at who's contributing, and doing some analysis and making recommendations around are there cost efficiencies that can be provided. So that's one area. It was sort of the efficiency and the money side of operations. The second is process mapping. I will be working with you, with staff, to look at how our service is being provided now, both to businesses and both to workers and job seekers. And are there, again, I'll do a baseline of what does it look like today, do some analysis, and then look and provide opportunities for you to look at, are there other ways we can be doing business differently? Are there other things that maybe other states are doing or other local areas? Are there best practices that we can incorporate? Are there different ways that we should be looking at it from a more smaller town area in the region versus Jeff City, for instance? So we'll be looking at all of that. So that's kind of an efficiency and effectiveness area. And then also, in addition to, I didn't put it on the PowerPoint, but one of the things I did was working with you as a board around being strategic too. So if there are any any facilitation or anything during any of your meetings, or any particular issue areas that you need help with facilitation, or you say, hey Mason, we're interested in this issue here. Can you bring in sort of what's going on in the United States right now? We want to have a discussion around sort of what's happening, and then we want to have a discussion amongst ourselves about, do we want to take this issue on, or how can we do this better? So that's one of the things I have in there, is attending, developing recommendations for strategic ideas, and facilitating things like that. And then finally, continuous improvement. We'll be supporting Alex with performance reporting. This is really where Kavita, I brought her into this project because we can do some analysis, we can do continuous improvement, we can look at your performance in certain areas and perhaps say, hey, maybe you should be focusing. Somebody mentioned demographics, that you're kind of concerned that maybe you're not English as a second language. EO, that's right, yeah. Well, that was a perfect example. I actually made a note because that's what I'm talking about when it comes to performance. Maybe one of the things we would say, hey, we look at the demographics of who you're serving. And then we can do a community analysis as well and say, hey, you're only serving 10% of the Hispanic 10% of your participants are Hispanic, yet 40% of the people living in your service region are Hispanic. Maybe you want to have a specific Hispanic outreach initiative, those kinds of things. So again, kind of gets to the part of the strategic. So we'll be using performance to help you as a board and those that are serving people with continuous improvement. So with that, So here are the principles I wrote down that I'm going to be working under, which are looking for opportunities for cost efficiency, customer service effectiveness, continuous improvement, and performance. So in a nutshell, that's why you've hired me, for those 4 things. And that's what I'm going to try to help you with. Are there any questions up to this point, or anything? Does that help, hopefully? Okay. I will say that the reason I'm really excited in particular about this project is because this really is a new way of thinking about, quote unquote, the one-stop operator role. I told Alex yesterday, I've seen a couple of other RFPs similar to this, but when you have about 600 local boards in the country, and there's only been about 3 or 4 or 5 that I know of that are going this direction, I would tell you, you're probably on the front end. So the pressure's on all of us to make this work well, because I think that it's a really great opportunity and a new way of thinking about what is the one-stop operator really supposed to do. So I want to talk to you a little bit about current trends and issues, and some of you were touching on some of these things when you were in your introductions to me. I really appreciate it, and I was making notes. I want to talk to you about new types of apprenticeship. You've probably heard that apprenticeship is a big deal for the Trump administration. And in fact, they just closed out on a grant application process for $150 million that community colleges could apply for. And again, Missouri applied for this, and I was involved in their application. I've been very involved, actually. Early on, I was asked by some of the staff in the White House to help with ideas. And I really was one of the ones that offered up some of these new apprenticeship ideas, because the current registered apprenticeship model, or is anybody familiar with registered apprenticeship at all? A little bit. It can be a cumbersome model. It's sort of, I call it a Mother May I model. And again, I think it's an old model. It's a model that takes an occupation, you have these 24 standards, you have to send in all this paperwork into the Department of Labor and get approval for a registered apprenticeship. Well, if you sit back and ask yourself, why would the federal government have to approve an apprenticeship program? I started asking people that question. I asked people at the White House that question. Why would the federal government? I start with that. The only reason I could think of was with a federal funding source was used for training, somebody like Pell Grant maybe, or something like that. I could see the federal government saying, hey, we want to make sure those dollars are spent wisely on a legit program. But other than that, I'm not sure why we're making people go through all these other hoops to get an apprenticeship program. And you get a lot of employers that don't want to deal with it. You get a lot of them that are nervous about it. So the new type of apprenticeship is more of an industry recognized, or you could even call it an accredited apprenticeship model. It's trying to devolve apprenticeship down to state and local areas. And it's really about, you can have more shorter term engagements. I think it's great for the justice involved individuals, for instance. We were just having this conversation. You could even take somebody maybe on a work release program if you had an employer say, hey, I'm willing to give a chance to half a dozen of people that are coming out of prison or jail. maybe you had I'm just throwing this out here because Kathy and I were just talking about it, like you had a work release program where you could start on-the-job training with an employer right there, do the related instruction, come in and help them with skills development while they're still behind the walls. They get released right into a job. I mean, so there's a lot of new things coming down around apprenticeship that present a lot of opportunities, I think, for businesses, for innovation in smaller communities. I think this is great, really helpful for small businesses. So I'm working, there's a National Industry Association near my house, actually, called the National Institute of Metalworking Skills, or NIMS for short. NIMS does all of the national, United States and international credentialing around machining occupations and now industrial maintenance technician occupations. It's a lot of different types of jobs, well-paying jobs too. NIMS also has a competency-based apprenticeship model that I'll be working with them here in Missouri and others if Missouri wins this grant, where we will partner with businesses. So if you have business that's interested, we'll come in and talk to you and work with you on defining the competencies you need for jobs. And that's another big change to the way we're doing apprenticeship. Right now, registered apprenticeship's about registering an occupation. The trend really needs to be, we are working with businesses to identify competencies for occupations. In a particular, whether it's healthcare, manufacturing, whatever, if you look at the competencies people need across all of your jobs within a firm, you'll have a lot of competencies in common. You'll have some across some of the jobs, and you'll have some that are unique to each job. But by defining competencies and understanding those, and then using those competencies to inform training and education as to what should they be teaching to, hopefully you can close that gap between education and training and the actual jobs. So the first thing I'm working with NIMS on is, and this is an area where a lot of, I think, neat work can be done in communities like this, is working with local employers to map the competencies and then to inform education and training delivery. Then one of the big, other big things is industry credentialing. And I actually just drafted a paper that I hope is going to get published by the American Enterprise Institute around non-credit training. And there's frankly not a lot of research has been done on this. And the research that has been done on it is we don't have a lot of data. We don't know what's happening with it. Well, I took a different approach, and I looked at, can non-credit training actually, can it be the same quality as for-credit training? Is it a legitimate means by which people can get skills and competencies to be gainfully employed? And the answer I believe and found is yes, if it's tied to industry recognized credentials. But we've got a slight problem. I did a paper in Kansas a couple of years ago where they asked, it was on these NIMS credentials, they said, hey, do employers even know what a NIMS Machining 1 credential means, and do they even need it to hire anybody? Well, real quickly, I'll tell you what we found. We found, one, the community colleges were in fact training for occupations in demand. They were training to occupations that employers actually had hiring needs and needed people in those jobs. 2, we found that the employers were very pleased with the skills and competencies that people had obtained at the college. So in other words, when they were applying for jobs, they said, yeah, they have the skills and competencies to perform and enter these jobs. 3, they said, we don't know what these NIMS credentials are, and we don't really use them in our hiring practices. But 4, we like that they finish something, so even though we don't really know what it is, it might mean that they're more employable. It's kind of became a proxy for soft skills or employability skills. So what it told me is that we need to be talking to businesses in a much more proactive way, whether we're workforce professionals, community college, staff, whatever it is. As we're working with businesses, we need to have a much more engaged discussion around your hiring, your recruitment can be centered on some of these industry credentials. It's not the usual associate degree, bachelor degree, master's degree sort of framework. We've got to work with employers to be more dynamic in aligning what's going on in education and training and what's going on in hiring and recruitment. And you're starting to see some of this discussion bubble up nationally if you watch the news and other things, where people are now starting to question, do I really need a 4-year degree to be gainfully employed and to have a good job and a good career? And people are starting, I mean, whether it's any of the business channels, you watch Fox Business, CNBC, I flip those channels a lot during the day while I'm working from home, and I see these conversations bubbling up all the time now, especially on the business networks. So we have a real opportunity, I think, to engage in a comprehensive discussion, but it can't just be, and right now it is to some extent in my opinion, it's just being held amongst the workforce and job training, or I call it the supply side. The supply side's doing all kinds of stuff right now around industry credentials, having students test to industry credentials while they're in community college programs, all kinds of things, but we're not having that discussion on the demand side, and we need to have that discussion on the demand side. It's not a linear, a lot of times if you ask a workforce professional, you'll say, what is business engagement defined as for you? It's, well, we need businesses to tell us what they need. What I've started arguing is it's not about a one-way linear relationship of have businesses tell you what they need. It's a cyclical feedback loop of businesses are talking to you about the skills and competencies and the occupations that they have and what their human capital needs are. But at the same time, you have to be engaging the employers on the other, going the other way to talk about, hey, we've got these industry credentials that represent those skills and competencies for the occupations you need. Would you be willing to include these in your hiring for your machinist occupations? We will teach to those credentials. Somebody that has that credential then speaks to you as an employer that this person is ready to be employed by me in this occupation. So this is a lot of work that's going on right now, and I'm personally sort of passionate about it. I think, in my opinion, this is kind of the key to all of this workforce development right now, is we've got to figure out how do we align all of this. Competencies that employers need, teaching and credentialing, and closing that gap between the supply and demand for labor, and being more efficient in how we get people connected to jobs. So that's a lot that's going on right now. Criminal justice reform and opioid addiction. I just, on the news this morning, I was mentioning a couple of people that in the lame duck Congress, Senator Rand Paul's wife is an advocate, was on the news this morning talking about the First Chance Act and how it's a bipartisan bill that may move during the lame duck. And it was about providing wraparound services to individuals, and she mentioned job training in particular, and treatment were the two issues she mentioned. So we need to keep an eye on that. I immediately emailed Alex and said, okay, this is something I'll help track for you in DC, because who knows, there may be grants and dollars. Again, I've been very involved with Alex, with Nancy Wiley out at State Technical College, around the work that's going on here locally with providing opportunities to individuals as they're being released. I also helped draft the application that the state put in for opioid addiction to the Department of Labor, that the Central Board has a key role. Really, once the money shows up, hopefully, you guys will actually kind of be running that project on behalf of the state. So a lot of opportunity there. I love the idea of working with the drug courts, with alternative sentencing, working with parole. As a condition of parole, they're going to get services through these programs. But now's the time. The economy's good. Employers need people. Now's the time, if we're going to get this right, to get this right. Helping individuals as they're being released have gainful employment so they don't go back to prison and jail, that they can hopefully find affordable housing, that they can get the treatment services they need. And for those that unfortunately have struggled with opioid or other substance abuse addictions, how do we help you? I've always been a big believer in that old adage that the best social program is a job. I always used to say that in speeches when I was at the Department of Labor. I continue to believe it to this day. You can provide somebody all the treatment, subsidized housing and stuff you want, but if they ultimately cannot end up existing through meaningful wages over time. And I'm also going to tell you, I'm going to get on my soapbox here for a second. With all the debates around living wage and other things, I still firmly believe that human beings, we were meant to work. We like to work. Work is a meaningful thing. I don't care if you're paid $1 an hour, $10 an hour, or $100 an hour. Work is valuable. And the human spirit was wired to be productive. We were meant to be productive. We were meant to work. We were meant to achieve and accomplish. I fundamentally believe that. And so that's why I like doing this kind of work, because ultimately it's, I think, helps the human condition, I think, hopefully, over time. And then, like I say, growing the economy of worker shortages. I'll finish up with this. I want to tell you a quick little story. So I was doing an evaluation for a grant down in Oklahoma City for Oklahoma City Community College. Their program was training workers who go into restaurants and other facilities to the commercial food equipment repair. And it's gas, steam, electrical, that sort of thing. So it's technicians. Go into hospitals to repair cafeteria equipment, things like that. And as I was interviewing employers here a couple of months ago, I said, I was asking questions about their workforce and, what are their challenging issues. I had these were all smaller employers, 50 or less employees typically. And one of them said, I literally could triple or quadruple my workforce right now if I had the people. There's another one down there said to me, I will hire literally on the spot any individual who comes to me who is, meets certain they have to drug test and other things, but if they meet all of that, I'll hire them. And it hit me, especially the employer that said triple or quadruple, and I thought, we have a lot of discussions nationally about GDP growth rates and GDP, and can we ever get to 3, 4, 5%? And it really hit me that, can you imagine right now what our economy would look like if we could get all the people who need skills skilled up for jobs, how much more we'd be growing? I fundamentally believe we're constrained right now economically by our lack of a skilled workforce and by employers who just don't have enough people that they can hire. That ties, frankly, to immigration policy, it ties to workforce policy, it ties to all of these things, and it's why, hopefully Congress or somebody, they can figure out how to get through some of the anger and Ernst and other things that are going on right now and try to solve some problems. But in the absence of that, we have to solve those problems, and that's fine. Communities can. And I want to help you with that. But boy, can you imagine if we could get employers the skills they needed. I had dinner last night with a local employer here, a little bit larger, who, same thing. I need operators, I need electricians, I need, it's everything. So anyway, it's a real great opportunity, if we can take advantage of it, to help individuals who typically are disenfranchised or not connected or don't have the networks to get employment. And that's it. I hope that answered any questions anybody had about who is Mason and why is he here. So, anything?
I have a couple, if you may.
Yeah.
We just passed a minimum wage initiative that brings...
Who's we, the state?
Pardon?
The state or locally?
Yes, the state.
Okay.
That brings the minimum wage up to $12 by 2023.
Okay.
What do you see as challenges with that aspect of things?
Well, do you want my conservative economist hat? Or to me, minimum wage discussions are irrelevant if we're skilling and training people up, because and especially now in an economy where you're starting to see wage growth too, because it's a supply and demand issue right now, whereas you have lots of demand, not enough supply. So what happens in Adam Smith's world, which is starting to happen, you do see the wage growth. If I'm $12 if I have a system by which an individual can get a NIMS machining credential and get connected to an employer, that person's coming in at $15 an hour. This situation, Oklahoma City was a perfect example. And Oklahoma City Community College were training individuals who tended to be more marginalized people. They did not have a lot of educational attainment, wage history, those sorts of things. And I asked every employer, what do they start at when they come out? And these are people with just industry credentials. They don't even have an associate's degree. And they were starting at $15 and $16 an hour with the opportunity of moving up pretty quickly within 6 months to a year of getting, And a couple of the individuals who had been trained and who had been on the job for a year, when I interviewed them, they were already making $16, $17, $18 an hour. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but...
So that should be more of our focus on that more upper echelon?
Yeah, I'll just give you I'll just be brutally honest. I mean, to me, minimum wage is an artificial inflation of wages for people who may not have the commensurate skills they need for jobs at that level if in the absence of training and education. Does that make sense? I mean...
I just wanted to take because...
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It seems as though it kind of changes our focus. We don't have to worry about maybe the lower end because the minimum wage will take care of that.
Yeah, except that the problem.
That's only for private industry.
Well, here's the other problem.
Industry doesn't have to meet minimum wage requirements.
I just
Yeah,
give
go ahead.
you another lens on this.
Yeah.
Today I have 450 positions open, and our average just across everything is $55,000 a year is what we pay. That's the average. So nobody gets paid less than $12 an hour anyway.
Right.
And I think, in my opinion, I think it is probably 70-30. I think 70% of our effort should be on getting people from the 12, 13, 14 to the $20 an hour, which is really, you can live in central Missouri.
Right.
And I still think we need a fair amount of emphasis, however, on getting people who have no jobs at all into the workforce and then bring them up. If you can start people at $12, $13 an hour in our area or whatever it is, and then it's our responsibility then as employers and community to get them moved up fast through whatever it is.
Yeah.
But $12 an hour, minimum wage means nothing to us. Now that's just one employer, I understand.
Well, and that's, I guess, what I'm saying too, hopefully. To me, I don't get charged up much about minimum wage discussions because I almost look at it as a moot issue. And I don't mean that to sound callous toward people who are on that lower end, but again, because of that very thing, I think that if you have an ability to get people enter, get work experience, get job training stuff, then they can. Our goal shouldn't be somebody only makes 7, 10, or 12, right? We should be working. Now, I would tell you, I think the challenge you'll see about raising minimum wage to $12, and you're starting to see it in Seattle and some places when you look at the economic research, and it pretty much plays out almost any time wages have been raised like that, it can actually create unemployment. Because what happens is, and again, there's a lot of misinformation around who's actually working in minimum wage jobs. It actually, if you look at a lot of the data, it hurts younger workers and such who, people like me, when I was 16, my mom said, hey, you got to go work at Burger King this summer, for, I think it was $2 and something at the time, or $3, or whatever in the 80s. But it could present you with challenges on that end, potentially, where you have people who maybe would have been working at $8 an hour, who all of a sudden the employer says, instead of 10 people at $8 an hour, I can only afford 8 people at $12 an hour. So then what happens to those 2 people who are now unemployed? So, but again, my feeling and approach would be similar to what Peter said, which is let's get some of this right with give people access to education, training, credentials, jobs, make sure that's all aligned to the jobs, work with the employers to identify those competencies. I think if you get that right, hopefully a minimum wage discussion becomes a moot point.
My other question, when you're doing your analysis work,
yes.
Would you be doing any type of market analysis within that?
I can, yes. I can do, I mean, one of the things I was hoping to do, again, some of the demographic, I was mentioning some of the demographic analysis, is look at your region, and I'll look at census, I'll use census data, and I also can look at Bureau of Labor Statistics data and any state data around where are the jobs, where are, and that's some of the strategic help I can provide too, in terms of some of the asset mapping, which is, are you, where should your you know, if you can't be all things to all people, let's just say, if you take that philosophy, so where should our top 2 or 3 strategic priorities be? Should they be in healthcare? Because there's a gazillion jobs in our region in healthcare. Should it be in manufacturing, because that's growing quickly? Should it be maybe something different in smaller communities, because we can build an entrepreneurial base of small businesses, and here's how we can support, I mean, so. Yeah, and you know, the small business thing is a really interesting issue because, again, you still look at the data in the United States, most people are employed by small businesses. When an economy grows like it is, you know, the Amazons of the world get all the attention moving to New York and Washington, D.C. area, which, by the way, is probably going to be awful for people like me that live in Northern Virginia, because it just means more traffic and more congestion and whatever else. But anyway, but at the end of the day, it's a small business economy. And how do we help, what's the name of your town again? I'm sorry. Potosi. I'll make sure I pronounce it correct. How do we help, you know, 4 new businesses start and grow in Potosi? Because at the end of the day, you're not going to get an Amazon headquartered there. Right. That's not going to be, your solution, as you know, and you've already stated, is going to be, how do we help an existing small business person add 2 people to his or her payroll? How do we help somebody who's got an idea about, I want to start a shop in downtown Potosi? How do I help them be successul so that business can then get going and hire people?
I love to hear that, because
yeah.
Way back when we talked about, it would be nice, like when people come and get a business application, we hand them an application and that's kind of it. It'd be great if we could develop some sort of, here are some potential state resources, here's some potential workforce resources.
Yeah.
And we could hand that to them also, that would give them sort of a leg up, rather than just, I got an idea, I want an application, I'm going to start a business.
Right. Yeah, it's hard because a lot of people have good ideas and such, but you know, I had to make that jump, right? And I was just mentioning this yesterday, that there's a couple of things that are tough when you decide to go out on your own. Number one on the tough part about going on your own is you go from every 2 weeks I've got a paycheck to I've got to have contracts in place, I've got to invoice, I've got to wait sometimes 60 to 90 days for somebody to pay me, and I've got to be able to do all that while I'm no longer collecting a paycheck every 2 weeks. So transitioning from that paycheck mentality to an invoicing or a revenue mentality is an adjustment. And unless you have some immediate resources or other things to be able to weather that 6 months, I've had quite a few people say, you know, what should I do to get in business for myself? I said, number one, you got to be able to survive on no money for 6 months, no revenue for 6 months. That's number one. You just got to plan on it. Number two is you better have, in my case where it's professional services, you need to have 2 contracts already lined up at the time you quit your job that you can immediately start doing work and invoicing. If you're a restaurant in downtown Potosi or something, you've got to have, you know, however many customers who are ready to come eat lunch there on day one. You got to be ready and able to get them hot food, good tasting food, right? Good service to them on day one. So really those are the two, you know, two real, and that's most people can't do that. So the question becomes, what are there sort of resources and other things that can help people in those kinds of areas? But yeah, please.
I don't know if time or not question.
Yeah.
Something you just mentioned, TR, about businesses. You give them the business side of it, but they're on their own when it comes to employment. So can you speak for a moment about, I didn't even know about any of the resources in this room whatsoever until I happened to hear about one grant, the HPOC grant.
Yes.
And then it's true that I know all this now about all these resources, and I'm tapping into them. My hunch is that most employers in our area know nothing about all of this here. Have you worked with any board or organization on how to get word out?
Yes.
About utilization?
Yeah, no, yeah, it's an ongoing systemic problem and a historical problem is where the resources are unknown. One is I'm a big believer in we need to do more integrated, I call it integrated business engagement. It can't just be Voc Rehab's talking to a few employers and TANF's talking to a few and Adult Ed's out there and Alex is trying, and then meanwhile the community colleges are all doing their thing. As a group, they need, I believe, work strategically together to reach. And plus, you don't want to be hit up by 6 different people on different initiatives, which happens sometimes too. So who do you as a business person work with that maybe it's Alex is my account owner, but she has access to to individuals who are working in getting skills in TANF or through Skill Up or these other programs. So that's one. Two is I'm also a big believer at the end of the day, there's no way any of them or any of us can hit each individual business. And so I think you have to have strategic with business intermediaries, chambers of commerce. Each chamber of commerce that's in the 19 county area should have a relationship with Alex, with you, figuring out how to use you peer-to-peer. Whether if you belong to some kind of healthcare association locally or regionally, how do we use that, you, Peter, and get the word out through that healthcare association? I think it just has to be that way. It's sort of like that kind of almost like guerrilla marketing in a way. It's the only way you can, because you can't ever, there's not enough money and budget to do big radio or brand kinds of things that a company might be able to do. So it has to be a lot of, I think, working through chambers, working peer-to-peer through industry, local and regional industry associations, other things. You look like, Alex looks like she has.
Well, I was going to touch on that.
Yeah.
We're getting there, Peter. We've
Oh, what's the
launched-
grizzly?
No, it's an issue. It's a struggle.
And
Yeah.
a comment, we've developed a Nexus group, and it actually came out of Kansas City through actually started by VR actually, to where we get all of our resource business service people together. I think it's happening bi-monthly now. Alan Galindo, our business service rep, is actually heading that up, and so he convenes meetings monthly or every 2 months with all of the resource coordinators who actually go out and call upon businesses. And so they're still a work in progress. We're probably about 9 months in to where I would be comfortable then with them formulating a plan with going out to talk to businesses. And so it is very much the model that you talked about, was just having kind of an account manager for each business, who do you know, like Energizer, because I have candidates who are able to work there. So we're working on that piece, but it's still a work in progress, Peter.
Yeah, just to give you an example, I come at it from when I was at Salt Lake Community College. So what I found out is I was sitting there, and of course, every time you want to apply for a grant, you have to have business partnerships, right? Well, so I also, the development and fundraising, so we were asking business, and then it hit me, I thought, wait a minute, our athletic department is hitting up businesses for sponsorships, and our student newspaper was hitting up businesses for advertisement. So anyway, one of the things I realized is just within a community college, we were hitting up the same business people 4 and 5 and 6 different ways. And so that was kind of my experience, my light bulb moment, where I was like, we've got to. So for instance, we created a customer relationship management system, which I'm a big fan of too. I don't, sometimes you may not be able to afford Salesforce or something, but some kind of shared system where everybody can go in and say, hey, Alex talked to Peter. Peter's this is what he needs. Da 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 da. So that you're not then and then everybody within the system. And I say system, people in this room and others have access to that kind of customer relationship management, so that you're not being asked to help with HPOG and then this, and then somebody else is coming to you for this initiative or that sort of thing. So that's pretty important too, I think.
I was fortunate enough this past summer to attend the Kauffman Foundation's
Okay.
Mayor's Conference on Entrepreneurship.
Okay.
That organization is so innovative.
Kauffman.
I was
Yeah.
wondering, have you ever touched base with them in the past? Or they are always looking for
Yeah.
innovative solutions to entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I probably need to. I've stumbled into their conversations, but I've never actually professionally engaged with them in terms of initiatives or anything. So I can
I'd love to make
definitely.
that connection.
Okay, yeah, I would love to. Yeah. And again, I would just say, my approach to consulting always is that, yeah, I have a contract, but I want to help you with whatever you need. And so, I have a great relationship with Alex. So, don't be shy. If there's something that comes up, you think, hey, we could use Mason's help on this. I'm open to whatever I can do to help you operate and deliver services in the way that makes the most sense. I appreciate you letting me know about the $12 minimum wage, because see, that's a perfect example of if you have that sort of factor that's coming into play economically, you can say, hey, Mason, you know, we got this $12 minimum wage going to be implemented in a couple years. How does that impact us? And I can do some research. I can, you know, look at, you know, what data that's there, like how many people are making under $12 now, and in what industries, and you know, even if you say, hey, can you do a quick analysis for us? I mean, I could try to do that, and you know, so at least you have some data around what should we expect. I mean,
Already
that's
had a couple of manufacturers say, are we going to have to raise exponentially our wage? Or so yeah, there are some concerns among existing businesses with that.
Yeah, well, and again, the problem if you're a business person with people along a spectrum of wages, especially if you're kind of in that area, is what happens to people that are making 12 now, and when the people making 8 get bumped up to 12? Do I have to take the people making 12 and bump them to 14? That's probably what you're starting to get right now. So what's the ripple effect of that? And so yeah, I mean, those are kind of small little projects or components that I could, you know, work with Alex on if the board has things, say, hey, we want Mason to look into this or look into that. And, you know, I'll obviously be providing continual, as I hear about grant opportunities and other things, we'll continually be in contact about those opportunities too. So,
Other
thank you so
questions?
much.